Hi, this is Matt at LSAT Lab, and today's lesson is on method questions in the logical reasoning section. And, well, method questions today comprise about 5% of all logical reasoning questions. That hasn't always been the case. If you look back over the history of the LSAT, it's actually closer to 1%, but if you look at the last 3 years, it's more like 5%. So we're going to treat it as a 5% frequency rate just because it is something that you're likely to face on test day. 5% of all logical reasoning questions are method questions. And in today's lesson, we want to cover the following. First, how do you spot a method question? What the process is for approaching them? What are the different types that you should be on the lookout for? And what are the common trap answers that you should really have in mind when you're working through the choices? So first, how do you spot a method question? Well, you're looking for language within the question stem that tells you that you're looking to describe the method. And so in this case, it's pretty obvious. Ask you to describe the method of reasoning. In this case, it says the argument proceeds by. So what's the procedure of the argument? Procedure or method, they mean the similar thing in logical reasoning. The economist responds to the critic by, so they're asking what's the mechanism by which the economist responds to the critic? So these are some common ways in which you might identify that you're working on a method question. Now, the process for approaching a method question is fairly straightforward. First, you want to find the conclusion, then you want to find the evidence for why it's true. Then you want to try to describe the way that the evidence relates to the conclusion. And well, we have a few different templates that we know are really common on method questions. And so we're going to kind of work through many of those in today's lesson. Then you want to use that understanding to anticipate what an answer would sound like. And then as you review the answer choices, you want to make sure that you're using the common trap answer patterns to make eliminations. All right, so here's an example. Let's go ahead and work one through and then use this as an opportunity to understand the first of the few templates that we're going to look at tonight. All right, when you have an answer that you like, go ahead and hit play again and we'll continue. All right, welcome back. So the conclusion of this argument is the last sentence. Clearly, we should subject meeting agendas to majority vote. The evidence for why that's the case is everything else. And it tells us in the first sentence, we must now settle on a procedure for deciding on meeting agendas. Then they give us 3 options according to the club's constitution: unanimous consent, majority vote, or assigning the task to a committee. It goes on to give us information why 2 of those options aren't very good. Unanimous consent is unlikely, and forming a committee isn't so good either. So if those 2 are off the table, it advocates that we put this thing to a majority vote. The conclusion advocates for one option, one of 3 different options, and it gets there by ruling out 2 other options. So ruling out alternatives is a really common method of reasoning. In fact, if you think about it, a flawed method of reasoning would be to fail to rule out possible alternatives, and that's also a common flaw. But that also means that the method of not failing to do so, actually doing so, is a correct method. Many of the methods that you'll encounter are essentially, they have relationships to the flawed methods. So one idea would be to argue from specific to general. Like, you're not allowed to say that because something happened one time that it's going to happen all the time. But you can argue from general to specific. You can't appeal to an inappropriate authority, but you can appeal to an appropriate authority. An appropriate authority would be somebody who's speaking within their field of expertise or was present at an event and could testify to what happened. So there are a lot of methods that you can think of that are related to flaws. And in this case, ruling out alternatives is a method. So ruling out alternatives is something that you really want to be on the lookout for. In method questions, 13% of the time, that's the method that you can use to describe what happened in that argument. So back to this example, we're looking for rules out alternatives among the choices. Answer choice A says that it rejects suggested procedures on constitutional grounds. Well, the conclusion is actually advocating a procedure. So this answer choice doesn't even get to the right conclusion. So let's eliminate A. Answer choice B says it claims that one procedure is the appropriate method for reaching every decision in the club. No. This argument is about how to decide on the meeting agenda. This is not about every single decision. Answer choice B is way too strong. Let's get rid of it. Answer choice C says, suggests a change to a constitution on the basis of practical considerations. This is not about suggesting a change to a constitution. This is about the procedure for deciding upon meeting agendas. So this is reaching the wrong conclusion. Answer choice D recommends a choice based on the elimination of alternative options. That looks pretty good. Hold on to D. Answer choice E says supports one preference by arguing against those who have advocated alternatives. Does this argument advocate or argue against advocates of previous positions or alternatives? No, there's nobody advocating alternative positions. So let's get rid of E, and that leaves us with answer choice D as the right answer. All right, so let's take a look at another example here, and we'll see another template at play. Go ahead and give this one a try. When you have an answer that you like, hit play again, and we'll review. All right, welcome back. So the conclusion of this argument is the last part of this thing. So societal laws are obeyed, not because the behavior is ethically required or because penalties await those who act otherwise, but because to act otherwise would be uncustomary. So it's not because of this, but rather because of that. And what are we talking about? We're talking about societal laws being obeyed. Why are they obeyed? Well, the evidence for this is that a law is successful primarily because the behavior it prescribes has attained the status of custom, just as manners are observed not because of scenarios attached to them, but because through repetition, contrary behavior becomes unthinkable. So in this case, they're basically saying that people obey societal laws for a similar reason to why they observe manners. So they're basically saying that societal laws are like manners. Well, what's the method there? See, what they're doing is they're comparing the two. They're using an analogous position. This is a really common form of how comparison plays a role on method questions, but analogies are one of the most common templates on method questions. So 32% of all method questions work through some sort of an analogy. Either they're refuting or they're proving through a comparison being made to something that's similar. So be on the lookout for analogies. It's a really common method. So now let's look at the choices. We're looking for advocating a position based off of some kind of analogous similarity. A says, as with manners and other customs, laws vary from society to society. Okay, well, this looks like it's going to be a little bit more complicated than just looking for the one that says it argues by means of an analogy. It looks like each of these choices are very similar. In fact, look at the way they begin. A says, as with manners and other customs. B says, as with manners. C is as with manners. D is as with manners. E is as with manners. All right, so the difference between A compared to B and E, B through E, is that A is talking about with manners and other customs. Are we talking about other customs here in this argument? They do talk about customs, but they're talking about manners attaining the status of customs. So this is a little different. I think as with manners and other customs, laws vary from society to society. Well, maybe I don't have to worry about the customs part so much. I know it's wrong, but laws vary from society to society. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about why do people obey societal laws, not that they're different from one place to another. So that reaches the wrong conclusion. I can get rid of it for that reason alone. Answer choice B says, as with manners, the primary basis for a society to consider when adopting a law is custom. Well, are we talking about the primary basis for a society to consider when adopting a law? Or are we talking about why people follow those laws once they're in place? Right? This is about why people obey societal laws, not about how those laws get created. So this has got the wrong conclusion as well. Let's get rid of B. Answer choice C says, as with manners, the main factor accounting for compliance with laws is custom. As with manners, the main factor accounting for compliance sounds like obeying or observing. This sounds okay. Let's hold on to answer choice C. Answer choice D says that as with manners, most laws do not prescribe behavior that is ethically required. Well, what does the argument say? Well, it says societal laws are obeyed not because the behavior is ethically required or because penalties await those who act otherwise. This seems to suggest that they are ethically required. This seems to be contradicting answer choice D. Let's get rid of it. Answer choice E says, as with manners, most laws do not have strict penalties awaiting those who transgress them. This feels very much like answer choice D. This is contradicting the argument. So that leaves us with answer choice C as the right answer. And the method of reasoning is an analogy. And while it was helpful, it didn't get us all the way there. We still needed to pick and choose between what was it that the argument was asserting, and does that match what was being stated inside of the answer choice? Or does anything presented in the answer choice actually go against what was being asserted in the argument? So the analogy was good. We needed it, but it didn't necessarily take us to one single choice. We still had to decide amongst them because they kind of all suggested that there was an analogy happening there. So let's look at another example. Go ahead and give this one a try. When you have an answer that you like, hit play again, and we'll continue together. All right, welcome back. So here says that it's justifiable for governments to subsidize artists because in order for them to make money from their art, they need to produce work that's going to gain widespread popular acclaim instead of the best work. Rahima jumps in and says, no. That depends on assuming that those two things aren't the same. That depends on assuming that producing work that gains widespread popular acclaim isn't the same kind of work that is going to be their best work. And attacks that position, says that doesn't need to be true. So in this question, we're being asked to describe how Rahima responds back to Sahira. And that's different than the first two examples. In the first two examples, we're being asked to describe how does the evidence relate to the conclusion. In this example, we're being asked to describe how does the second person go about undermining the first person. So this is another really common form that you want to be thinking about, many method questions work through an attack on original claim. So you have two speakers. Speaker one says something and speaker two challenges that position. And then they ask you to describe how does the second person undermine the first person. So if you think about how you're going to weaken an argument in logical reasoning, that's how the second person is going to respond to the first person, because that's how the LSAT thinks. So attacking an assumption is a pretty common type on method questions. Be on the lookout for arguments that the second person responds or challenges the first person by noticing an assumption of the first person's argument and then directly challenging it. If they talk about an implicit assumption, that's something that wasn't stated. If they talk about an explicit premise, then that means that they're attacking something that was stated. Both of those are valid methods. You can attack an explicit premise. You can attack an assumption. So what we're looking for in the answer choices is that Rahima responds by attacking an assumption. Answer choice A says disputes an implicit assumption of Sahira's. That looks pretty good. Let's hold on to answer choice A. Answer choice B says presents independent support for Sahira's argument. Rahima is not supporting Sahira's argument. That is reaching the wrong conclusion. Answer choice C says accepts Sahira's conclusion, but for reasons different from those given by Sahira. That's, again, reaching the wrong conclusion. Rahima is challenging Sahira's conclusion, not supporting it. Answer choice D says uses Sahira's premises to reach a conclusion different from that reached by Sahira. Well, there's two ways to look at this. I'm not sure that Rahima is really using Sahira's premise or premises. And second, Rahima's not really reaching a conclusion in general. Rahima's just suggesting that the assumption of Sahira's argument isn't necessarily true. So while Rahima does seem to be challenging, Rahima's not really offering something else in return. So D, offering a new conclusion, doesn't really match what Rahima's here for. Let's get rid of it. Answer choice E says, argues that a standard that she claims Sahira uses is self-contradictory. Well, Rahima's evidence is that the assumption isn't true. Rahima's evidence is not that Sahira's argument is self-contradictory. So the premise that's implied in answer choice E is not the same that Rahima is suggesting. Right? Rahima is suggesting that the assumption of Sahira is not true, but that's not the same as being self-contradictory. So answer choice E implies a different premise than what we see Rahima using. So that leaves us with answer choice A is the right answer. All right, the last example for this lesson. Go ahead and give this one a try. When you think you have an answer that you like, hit play again, and we'll continue to review together. All right, welcome back. So Lance says that every general rule has at least one exception. And Frank says, well, if we follow that idea, right, then there is at least one general rule that has no exceptions. Right? The exception to that general rule would be what Frank is providing here. And it doesn't really make sense to have at least one general rule with no exceptions and every general rule with at least one exception. Essentially, if we take Lance's idea and we run with it, we end up in a place that can't possibly be true. So what is Frank doing? Frank is saying, okay, if I accept your conclusion to be the case and I see where it goes, it leads me into a contradictory idea, right? So in this case, there is a self-contradictory outcome of accepting the conclusion, right? In this case, accepting the conclusion leads to an absurd consequence. And that's a pretty common idea where the second person basically says, okay, I'm just going to accept your idea, see where it goes. Oh, but it can't go there. Therefore, your idea is wrong. Look out for arguments on method questions where the second person goes about undermining the first person by running with their idea, running with the conclusion reached by the first person until it reaches an absurd consequence. And then coming back and saying, okay, therefore your idea doesn't make any sense. So in this case, we're being asked to describe how Frank goes about undermining Lance. Answer choice A says, demonstrating that Lance assumes the very thing he sets out to prove. Okay, that sounds like it's describing a flaw, right? But Frank isn't really describing a flaw in Lance's argument. Frank is running with Lance's conclusion to show that it leads to an absurd consequence. Answer choice A is simply using the wrong premise here. Right? That's not what Frank uses as support for why Lance is wrong. Answer choice B says, showing that Lance's conclusion involves him in a contradiction. That actually looks pretty good. It says that Lance's conclusion, if we follow it, it leads to a contradiction. So let's hold on to answer choice B. That sounds like what we prephrased. Answer choice C says, showing that no general rule can have exceptions. Well, what is the opposite of what Lance is saying? Lance is saying that every general rule has at least one exception. The opposite of every is not every. So to challenge Lance's conclusion is not to go so far as to say no general rule can have exceptions, but just to say that not every rule has at least one exception. So C is strengthening Frank's conclusion beyond which Frank goes to, right? That's simply too strong. Answer choice D says, establishing that experience teaches us the opposite of what Lance concludes. Well, it's not that experience teaches us that. It's that if we accept it and we run with it, it leads to somewhere bad. So D is simply using the wrong premise. Answer choice E says, showing that it has no implications for any real cases. Well, Frank is not going to real cases. Frank is staying inside of the world of generalizations. So answer choice E is reaching the wrong conclusion. Let's get rid of it. And that leaves us with answer choice B as the right answer. All right, so that takes us through a little bit of a tour of some of the common types. But let's look at a broader range of types. So we looked at analogy. 32% of method questions rely on an analogy within it in order to make the argument work. 13% use an example. We saw absurd consequence, 13% use that. We saw rule out alternatives, another 13% use that. Attack and assumption is something else we saw, 10% use that. New information, so presenting new information, additional information to undermine somebody else's position. So this would be like on a weakening question. If you're presenting, you're not attacking something that was stated or unstated. You're presenting new information that changes the balance. If you're comparing something, you're presenting information that would change the equation so that the decision reached or the recommendation reached is not necessarily as good as it was initially suggested to be. You can attack a premise just like you could attack an assumption. 3% do that. And 3% provide an alternative explanation to the one that was presented. Notice that a lot of these are clearly attacking methods, like attack a premise, attack an assumption, reaching an absurd consequence. Some of these others, like analogy, example, new information, alternative explanation, these ones could be somebody asserting an argument to be true, but it also could be someone attacking a previously stated position. You could use an analogy to show that something is not the case, or a disanalogy. You could show how those two things that were supposedly similar are not similar. Or you could provide a counterexample to an argument previously stated. So look out for ideas of analogies, examples, absurd consequences, alternatives. These are the common types that you're going to likely see on method questions. The trap answers you want to be on the lookout for. Answer choices that reach the wrong conclusion. We're talking about the relationship between the evidence and the conclusion. So many times when you're looking at the answer choices that are wrong, the reason why they're wrong is that they're asserting the argument does something or gets to a place that doesn't actually occur within the argument. And 44% of the time, answer choices are wrong because they're asserting somebody did something that they didn't. Like they're reaching the wrong conclusion. 31% are wrong because they're asserting the wrong evidence, right? If they're trying to describe the relationship between the evidence and the conclusion, it's really common for an answer choice to get half of that wrong. Another 13% are wrong because they're simply describing things in language that is much stronger than what happened inside of the argument. And another 13% are wrong because they're simply contradicting the information that was there initially. So the process, remember, for method questions, find the conclusion, find the evidence for why it's true, then discover the relationship between those two, use that relationship to anticipate an answer, and then use trap answers as you work through the answer choices. You spot a method question by the language in the question stem itself. You're looking for language that says describes the method or precedes by or responds by. These are some pretty common language cues. You also want to give some flexibility. You'll see these in other ways, but you're looking to figure out how does the method occur or how does somebody respond to someone else. The trap answers to be on the lookout for, again, remember, are wrong conclusion, that they're asserting you get to the wrong place or that they're asserting that someone used a different premise than was actually used. Answer choices that are too strong and those that simply contradict the argument. So that's it for today's lesson on method questions. I invite you to check out some of these other lessons or visit us today at lsatlab.com.